Hi, it's Story with Caitlin Studio. Welcome back to another episode, and in today's video I will be building a wood table with steel spider legs. Now this table is white oak and I'm just rough cutting the boards just on the miter saw here. So the table measures in at 72 inches long by 40 inches wide. So I'm just cutting those boards to length, and then here I am just running them through the jointer. Now this table, I actually ended up building 3 of them, and I'm just showing the video for the one, but I'm just running those boards through the the jointer, and then once I do the face, I go over to the edge jointing. Now I did have to run it through a few times. It was a pretty big unwieldy board, but once I've done that, I just take it through the planer. And after I've sort of done 3 sides there, I finally take them over to the table saw, and I'm just trimming off that last edge. Now you could run them through the planer, but I prefer to do them on the table. Now here I'm just sort of showing when I'm gluing up the tabletop, I want to orient the rings so that they alternate back and forth. Now that last board, you can see that it was kind of the other way, so I'm just sort of flipping it over. Now the reason why you orient the grain that way is so that as humidity moves in and out of those boards, if those boards cup a bit, they'll just sort of alternate the way they cup. And so you can see after I've done that, I've just kind of moving those boards back and forth and finding out the best grain matching, because I want this table to look as seamless as possible. So yeah, I'm just sort of organizing those boards back and forth and just kind of line up the grain and the color of the wood and just sort of going back and forth. But once I finally do that, I'm just going over to use the domino on that tabletop. Now I like to use the domino just to keep that tabletop glue up nice and flat. I find spending that extra time right off in the bat of just using the domino to attach that table, I won't have those boards sort of slipping up and down, because with that, when you do clamp it up, that glue does have a tendency to slip, and so you won't have a perfectly flat tabletop. So yeah, I've just put all those dominoes in, and I'm just sort of tapping them in, and then once I get them all tapped in, I'm just adding the glue. Now I like to use just a regular wood glue here because this table is on the inside. I don't have to worry about waterproof glue or anything like that. I just take my time just sort of brushing out on the edges so it's got a nice even consistent glue line. And then once I do that, you can see I put in those dominoes. I'm just sort of pushing those boards in. So again, having those dominoes in there just keeps it aligned properly. So just go over to the clamps, and I'm just using my parallel clamps here and just clamping them up. And usually when I do use those clamps, I like to space them about 1 foot apart. Now after that tabletop is glued up, I just cut off the end with my track saw here. Now I often will oversize the table at about 3 inches on each end, just so that in case I have any checking on the end or there's some tooling marks left over, I can just cut those off, and I can have a nice, just that nice length of the table. And whenever I do have that oversized, I always contact my customer and just say, hey, your table's going to be a little bit bigger. Do you want it bigger or the exact size? And most people really appreciate that. But yeah, after I've done that, cut it to the right length, I'm just starting the sanding process, and you can see here that I just kind of work it sort of back and forth and sort of do lines. And what I find then doing it this way rather than sort of random all over the table is that I know that I've sanded the particular part. So it's almost like, imagine cutting your grass, you just sort of go back and forth. Now I did end up finding I have a little bit of surface cracking, so I just kind of fill those spots with some CA glue, and then I come later with some activator and I just spray them down. And then once I do that, I can bring my sander back and just even those out. I find that CA glue is actually pretty hard, so you need to go with your sander on it quite a bit just to make them nice and flush. And yeah, once that's all said and done, I just vacuum it out and make sure that I got all the cracks and any little holes. But oh, there's Toby here. He decided to give me a little bit of a visit. He was feeling pretty lonely, so it's that part of the video where I show him. But I did have a knot on one end, and I just kind of cleaned it out with a chisel there. And then I came in with some clear epoxy, and I just filled that crack. Now, I did end up actually doing that right at the end of the night, and I thought I fully filled that in, but that epoxy has a tendency to really seep into all the little cracks and voids. So when I was all done, it was filled in, but the next morning when I came back, it was actually, there was a bunch of low spots and there was some bubbling. So I had to take my Dremel tool in there, and I just cleaned out all those little burrs and those holes, because I didn't want to pour in more epoxy and then you end up seeing those bubbles in there. So yeah, I just took my Dremel in there and cleaned out those holes, and I just sort of brushed it out. I made sure it was nice and even there. And then finally I could come back with that epoxy, and I just did a clear epoxy, and I just filled those holes right in, and just made sure that this time there was no air bubbles. So I took that torch and I just kind of got rid of all those excess bubbles. And then by the time it was all said and done, I just sanded it off. And finally after that, I'm just doing a round over on the edge here, and I like to use a 1/8 round over on modern furniture. And usually the corners I do 1/4 inch, just because it gives a little bit of a softness. And then once I've done that, I just go hand sand the edge and just kind of work my way along the edge and just sand it, because I find sometimes that router will leave a little bit of an impression on it. But once basically that tabletop is done now, so now I'm just sort of placing those steel legs, and again, it's a spider leg, so they just sort of slot in there. And now I'm just sort of measuring where exactly those threaded inserts are going to be, because I don't like to use screws to go right into the wood. I like those threaded inserts. And then once I measure that up, I just mark out where those holes are. And yeah, I find got to be really finicky here to make sure that I place them well, because otherwise I don't want to be able to attach those legs after the fact and find that one of those holes are off. So I just, take my time and mark out those spaces. But those steel legs, they do have a little bit of a bigger hole, so that when I come in with my drill bit, there will be a little bit of wiggle room just as I come along. But with those steel inserts, I do use a 10.5 millimeter drill bit, and then I make sure I pull out all that sawdust, those wood chips, and then I use a countersink bit. And then there's a little bit of an impression left by that bit, so I just sand it in. And then when I do attach those threaded inserts, I like to put just a touch of epoxy in there just to keep them in place, so that if down the road someone ends up over tightening those legs, that those threaded inserts will stay in place. Yeah, and then I just go through and do all those. And here you can see I've got a brand, so I just apply that brand, and I like to use that little jig just to keep it nice and straight. And then when I do burn that in, I just sand it in after the fact. And then finally, I'm just moving on to the sanding or the finishing process. You can see I'm using the Osmo Raw, and I find that it just does a really nice finish on this. And I've got a white Scotch-Brite pad, and I just kind of work it in all throughout, and the initial coat looks really good. And then once I've done that initial coat, I like to come in with just some shop towels after the fact and wipe it off. Now I found if you leave that finish on kind of heavy, it just kind of glops and it doesn't look good. So if you do apply this finish yourself, just make sure that you use some shop towels and just wipe off any of that excess. And I like to wipe off the excess on the edge first, and then just wipe that edge just along the grain when it's all said and done. And then once it's all done, you can see here the tabletop and how it turns out. And there's some really nice grain variation, but yeah, after I've got it in, I installed or brought the tables and put them in, but they look great. The customer was happy, but you know, that's the video. But thanks for watching and have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care. Bye.